So many people have covered Disney's Renaissance: The Lion King, The Little Mermaid, Hercules, Mulan. Disney's theatrical run from 1989 to 1999 at this point is legendary. And even I've talked about it at length on this channel in my Disney Eras playlist, but something I don't see a lot of people talk about is Disney's television animation, and really the renaissance on TV with animation that started with the Disney afternoon. When Michael Eisner took over as CEO of the Walt Disney Company in 1984, he wanted to explore the idea of animation on television. In that year, he created a brand new department, Disney's television animation, and he pitched a show based around his kids' favorite candy, gummy bears. In 1984, they would put 2 shows into production: The Woozles, which would only last 13 episodes and 1 season, although I wish it would, for whatever reason, come on Disney Plus, even though Disney Plus doesn't have it, but whatever, and the more popular Gummy Bear Adventures. Gummy Bear Adventures would end up on NBC's Saturday morning lineup, and was so popular that Disney opted to start greenlighting a bunch of other shows. Ducktales was the next major show to debut in 1987, and it would take a radically different approach than that of Gummy Bears. Instead of ending up on Saturday mornings, it would end up on weekday afternoons, and instead of 1 new episode a week, you would get at least 4 new episodes a week of Ducktales. Ducktales was also a leap forward from Gummy Bears, as Michael Eisner opted to up the production budget to $20 million in that first year. This would help Ducktales really stand out from the rest of television animation, not just because of the time slot, but because of how good the show actually looked. The first season of 65 episodes would also feature new and old Disney characters with a brand new twist. We would see Scrooge McDuck as well as Huey, Dewey, and Louie, but we would also get introduced to Webby and Launchpad McQuack as they went on Indiana Jones-style adventures. It was really a great way to reintroduce some of these characters to a younger generation, while grabbing older generations who would reminisce about these characters they grew up on. Another show that went into production was about mice. The Rescuers show was actually pitched as a sequel to the Rescuers movie. But since The Rescuers Down Under was already in production, Disney didn't want to have a TV show and a movie for The Rescuers coming out. The idea to still have a show around mice was pitched, but having all new characters. But Michael Eisner liked the idea so much of what Ducktales was doing with older characters, he pitched the idea of using Chip and Dale to substitute some of the mice. Again, the same formula would be applied from Ducktales. We would get old characters with a new twist, this time Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, with Chip and Dale looking more like Indiana Jones and Magnum P.I., popular characters of the 1980s. And the show's budget would also one-up from Ducktales, getting a $28 million budget for its initial run and debuting in the summer of 1989 on Disney Channel before eventually moving to syndicated TV and joining Ducktales in a 1-hour block in the afternoons. Disney would finally launch the Disney Afternoon in 1990 with a 2-hour block that featured a new show called Talespin, a diesel punk style show that featured characters mostly from the Jungle Book, and they would add the Gummy Bears in to fill out the format. The popularity of Disney Afternoon skyrocketed, mostly because of the 4 shows having such great budgets and having great stories, as well as the marketing team being so on point with trying to get Disney's television animation across to a wider audience. And starting in 1990, that's when we began seeing this giant boom not just with Disney, but in all of television animation. Across the way in Burbank, Warner Brothers was also looking to get more into the television animation game. They put together a big budget and collaborated with Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment to create the 1990 show Tiny Toon Adventures. And that collaboration would continue, as Amblin Entertainment and Warner Brothers would continue to make shows, mostly Animaniacs, Pinky and the Brain, and Freakazoid. And Warner Brothers would also collaborate with DC, which would create several superhero shows, and most notably the beloved show Batman the Animated Series, which still to this day I hear about all the time. People love to talk about it. People like to talk about the subsequent movies that came out in the 90s with it. Batman was a huge deal. What can I say? And outside of Disney and Warner Brothers at this time, there were all kinds of other shows just blossoming up everywhere. Marvel would have their own shows with X-Men the Animated Series and Spider-Man, and Nickelodeon would launch their own idea of a 2-hour block of TV animation with Rugrats, Doug, and Ren and Stimpy. And as the years went by, the Nickelodeon Nicktoons would continue to get added to. We would get Cat Dog and Rocko's Modern Life, Hey Arnold, Our Real Monsters, and the list goes on and on and on. There's tons of shows that I could really talk about. There were shows on Saturday mornings, there were shows after school, there were even shows on before school. The success of Disney Afternoon was so well met that Disney's theme park division opted to create a festival around it at Disneyland in 1991. They called it Disney Afternoon Avenue and would base it on those original 4 shows we talked about. And if you want to hear about the attractions or the meet and greets or some of the things that happened at that festival, go over to the Patreon page because I made an entire video exclusive to Patreon about it. The Disney Afternoon really became the anchor point for the boom in animation on television, and it would continue to grow from its initial year. The following year, the Gummy Bears would get dropped and replaced with a brand new show, initially called Double-O Duck, but we would all know it as Darkwing Duck. Interestingly enough here, Darkwing felt like a continuation of Ducktales. The setting of the show, St. Canard, which kind of felt like Gotham City, had some sort of connection to Duckburg, the setting for Ducktales, as Darkwing Duck would gain characters from the Ducktales show, that being Launchpad McQuack and Gizmo Duck. And when Ducktales was dropped from the 2-hour time slot, it would be Goof Troop that would take its place the following year, and it would repopularize the Goofy character, the same way that Chip and Dale were repopularized with the Rescue Rangers, or DuckTales repopularized Scrooge McDuck. The show was so successful that it would even gain its own spin-off movie, a Goofy movie, which would become a major cult hit among many Disney fans. Trust me, if you're a Disney fan watching this, you probably have seen a Goofy movie and you probably love it. I know who you are, and you love it. And after the success of Goof Troop, we would see Bonkers, a less successful show, but a show inspired by Roger Rabbit and old Hollywood. And it would feature cameos from a ton of old Disney animated characters. And Bonkers was actually a spin-off from another Disney show that was syndicated to CBS on Saturday mornings called Raw Toonage. It was around this time that Disney wasn't just putting their shows on Disney Afternoon, but also syndicating other shows to CBS, NBC, and ABC. And their Disney Afternoon shows would also spill over into reruns on Saturday mornings. And even though Bonkers wasn't very successful, the first real major failure for Disney Afternoon was the Schnookums and Meat funny cartoon show. Like the Woozles, this show would only have 1 season and 13 episodes, which would showcase over 2 months that happened in early 1994. The show itself was a little bit edgier than the other Disney Afternoon shows and was stylized similar to Ren and Stimpy. But what the show lacked was familiar characters. The star power that went along with DuckTales and Rescue Rangers and Darkwing Duck just seemed to make those shows work. So that same year, Disney would also launch its first theatrical spin-off show, Aladdin. Aladdin, the animated show, would take the characters that we knew and loved from the movie and put them into weekly new adventures. And this show would be so successful, Disney would opt to do several spin-offs, like Hercules, The Little Mermaid, Timon and Pumbaa, and eventually 101 Dalmatians. And those shows would continue on to Disney Channel in the 2000s when Disney Afternoon was gone. We would see shows for The Emperor's New Groove, or Lilo and Stitch, etc. And a personal favorite show of mine that would debut on Disney Afternoon was Gargoyles, which felt a lot like Batman the Animated Series. And similar to Schnookums and Meat, but in a good way, the show was a departure from what Disney Afternoon had been. Gargoyles was a much more serious, dramatic show focusing on the stone figures that would be vigilantes saving New York City in the night. The show would automatically become a cult hit and would outlast all of the other Disney Afternoon shows in media form, as it would go in and out of print and comic books even into the 2000s. The second failure that came out of Disney Afternoon was Quack Pack, a show featuring Donald and Daisy Duck, as well as the nephews Huey, Dewey, and Louie, but this show felt off from the beginning. It would take more inspiration from a show like Goof Troop than it did DuckTales or Darkwing Duck. The show focused on the teen years of Huey, Dewey, and Louie as they would go out with Donald and Daisy on a news report to find that week's news story and adventure. The disconnect for this show was the lack of consistently set up by the other Duck shows, DuckTales and Darkwing Duck. Being able to see a continuation with characters like Launchpad McQuack felt off-putting, as well as adding human characters into the Duck world, which had previously not been seen on the other Duck shows. And this show felt more like a copycat of Goof Troop than it did anything else, lacking a lot of creativity on its end. The last show to debut on Disney Afternoon was 1996's The Mighty Ducks, and honestly, I could make an entire video just about this show and its 26-episode run. In fact, I probably will in the future. And the show is absolutely nuts, and in an awesome way. Not at all tied to the Mighty Ducks movies, and sort of kind of tied to the real sports team that Disney launched in Anaheim. The Mighty Ducks is about an alternate universe where ducks are actually people, and they're space aliens that travel to this universe where they land in Anaheim and play ice hockey to adoring fans that in no way have any problem with them being giant alien ducks for some reason, and outside of playing hockey, they also fight a villain gang led by a dragon creature voiced by Tim Curry. If that sounds crazy, yeah, it was. And this was also a spin-off of the very popular Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles format, and by the way, the Mighty Ducks was not the only one. The Teenage Mutant Turtles had a lot of copycat shows, including Biker Mice from Mars, and Cowboys of Moo Mesa, and Street Sharks. Jawsome. So yeah, the mid-90s were a weird time. For anybody who didn't live through it, I guess you're lucky? I don't know. I kind of like these shows, but I understand that they're really, really weird. In 1997, though, Disney Afternoon would just fall apart, and for several reasons. The first of which being Disney acquiring ABC in 1995. And Disney would begin airing new shows on their ABC One Saturday Morning lineup. Shows like Pepper Ann or Recess that would have ended up on Disney Afternoon ended up on ABC's new Saturday morning lineup because Disney owned the network at this point. That meant that without any new shows, the Disney Afternoon would basically become reruns of old shows. But another thing happened at this time. Disney opted to create a second cable network in 1998 that they labeled Toon Disney, which would basically be their spot for reruns of all the old Disney Afternoon shows. So there was no need for the actual Disney Afternoon to run those shows. And as more and more cable providers had Toon Disney, it would grow in popularity and new shows would then be added there. And Toon Disney would then transform into what we know today as Disney XD. The biggest change, though, wouldn't just impact the Disney Afternoon, but all of television animation as a whole. The FCC would introduce the Children's Television Act in 1990 and would put restrictions on what animated shows could or couldn't do. The FCC asked for more educational and information television for children, and they restricted the amount of advertisements and the types of advertisements that you could show during cartoons or any children's entertainment on television. And though the 1990 restrictions were there, they weren't heavily enforced or regulated. And the FCC would then revisit those regulations in 1996. The reform of the Children's Television Act in 1996 saw stricter and clearer guidelines for networks. TV networks would have to show at least 3 hours of educational and informational children's television a week, and the advertisements would be closely watched, and fines would be administered to any network or television producer that went past those guidelines. Networks would also be required to publish a quarterly report of their children's programming in order to comply with the new FCC rules. These stricter regulations made TV networks and TV producers rethink the programming they were putting out and the formats in which they were putting them out in. Disney's One Saturday Morning, for example, would splice in small informational bits between shows and would even focus on new shows about animals and science. And the cable networks would start focusing on preschool entertainment that would also be educational, like Sesame Street. Both Disney and Nickelodeon would have their full blocks in the morning called Disney Junior and Nick Jr. respectively. And Disney started to focus less and less on television animation and more on live action shows that focused more on families and teen audiences. Shows like Even Stevens or Lizzie McGuire would be shows that would soften the restrictions from the FCC, allowing more money to be made through advertising and not a need to have educational programming throughout those blocks. The focus on teen and family content would allow for more advertising revenue, as well as lesser restrictions that didn't have to have any educational purpose. By the early 2000s, we would see less and less of TV animation on Saturday mornings or on weekday afternoons. And eventually, a lot of those shows would completely die off from syndicated television and move to their own cable networks that were completely dedicated to animation, like Cartoon Network or Disney XD. All of that aside, it doesn't lessen the importance and impact that the Disney Afternoon had. The Disney Afternoon would create a television animation renaissance that would still have lasting effects to this day. Before the Disney Afternoon, television animation was done cheaply and done crudely. There was never a need to create episode-to-episode serial storylines, and there was never a need to really focus in on the settings or creating well-rounded characters. The focus was mostly on sight gags and comedy. But the 1990s brought around serious dramas and serials, settings that felt believable and loved. Animation's popularity in general on television, whether it's preschool entertainment on Disney Junior, or whether it's adult animated cartoons like Archer on FX, can all be thankful that Disney Afternoon paved the way for them. And for me personally, I'm glad I grew up in this era. I'm glad I got to see these shows as they ran their course for the first time. And I'm glad to now be revisiting them on all the different streaming networks, as well as continuing to be such an animation fan. I owe a lot of my love for animation to the Disney Afternoon, spending every afternoon running home from school just so that I could see my favorite characters on TV. If you grew up during this era, I would actually love to have your comments down below. Fill the comment section with your favorite shows, your favorite characters, the things that you loved growing up and seeing on Disney Afternoon, or just in general from television animation. If you're a kid that didn't grow up in the 1990s, but maybe the 2000s or later, leave your comments down below on some of the shows that you would like to have seen or will see now that they're all on the streaming services like HBO Max and Disney Plus and Netflix and Amazon. All those shows are out there, you can find them, and they're having a huge resurgence. We've seen Ducktales get a resurgence, Animaniacs is coming back. All these shows that I loved are coming back, but there's so much great animation that's out there from the past few years or from the 2000s or from the 1990s. I'd love to hear your comments down below about some of your favorite animated television shows. Give me those. I would love to hear from you. And for those of you that still want to see the Disney Afternoon Avenue video, check out the Patreon page. You can find that link down below. I post podcasts and videos there all the time. For just $1, you can jump into our Discord server. You can chat with me about anything. We've chatted about animated shows before. We've chatted about movies. We've chatted about video games. It's a fun time. Jump in the Discord and let's chat. And you can also get the podcasts and videos at the $3 and $5 level. It's a good time. Lastly, if you want to continue to support the channel, there's merchandise down below. The videos on anytime you watch them on a computer or anytime you watch them on your phone, the merchandise is just like right there down below. There's also a link down in the description box if you don't see it there. But in the meantime, thank you for watching. And as always, my friends, keep moving forward.